What's up, everybody? My name is Scott Paddock, and today we are going to talk about how to improvise over two different chords. One of the questions I get asked the most in my comments on social media is someone asking me about what scale they should use to improvise on a specific song. In other words, they'll name a song and say, what scale can I use for improvisation on that song? Now, a lot of songs, especially you're talking about pop songs and some blues songs and that kind of stuff, one scale will get you through the whole song. But that is definitely a more beginner, early, intermediate way of dealing with improvisation. And the way you should really think about it is through playing the chord changes. So today, I'm going to show you how to improvise using two different chords. And we're going to take a really simple approach just so you can kind of figure out how to make that transition. In the beginning, it sounds way more difficult than it is. Once you figure out how to do it, it becomes really easy. And then you just plug in the right scale to the right chord, and then you're off to the races. So we are going to start off with 2 measures of G7 and 2 measures of C7. Now, if you don't already know how to read chords, I would definitely suggest checking out my video on chords. That will explain everything. Also, maybe check out my video on how to improvise. That will help you with improvising. But this video is going to be based mainly on how to switch between 2 different chords. So again, we're going to do 2 measures of G7 into 2 measures of C7. So a G7 is based on your G major scale, and then the 7 in the G7 means it has a flat 7. So it's between G and G with an F natural. So that's your G mixolydian scale, if you want a little bit of theory there. So it's just G to G with no sharps or flats. The chord for your G7 would be G, B, D, and F. So the first thing we would do is chord outline it. So all I'm doing are playing the notes that correspond to that G7 chord. I'm playing G, B, D, F, and then playing a G at the top and coming down. G, F, D, B. So I go G, B, D, F, G, F, D, B. The next chord is C7. We're going to do C7 for 2 measures. So we're doing G7 2 measures, C7 2 measures. So the C tells you that it is based off of the C major scale, and the 7 tells you that it has a flat 7th. So it is the C mixolydian scale, which is from C to C with a B flat. Now the chord that corresponds with that would be C, E, G, B flat. That's your 1, 3, 5, and flat 7 in the key of C7. So we would do a chord outline for that also. So again, those notes are C, E, G, B flat, C, B flat, G, E, and then I put a C at the end. So the first step is putting those 2 chords together. So we're going to chord outline the G going up and down, and chord outline the C going up and down. Now, when I switch to that C7, I'm sure you can hear the chord change. That's what we want. That's what you want in your playing. You want to be able to hear the chord change in your improvisation. So take a listen to it one more time. You got to hear that C7 change. So your first strategy for improvising over the chord changes is just doing a chord outline solo. So we're going to use those notes in the chord, and we're just going to play a cool rhythm that goes along with it. So those are all notes that fit in the G7 chord and then in the C7 chord. Now I started on the root each time. You can kind of start anywhere. You can repeat notes. You can do anything as long as you're playing the notes that are in the chord. Take a listen. So that already sounds way more like a solo than chord outlines. So that is your first step. The second step is playing the scale that goes along with the chord. So for G7, again, that would be your G mixolydian scale. So that's G to G, all natural. So you have F natural because the G7 tells you to flat the 7. So your F sharp would become an F natural. So the first thing that we're going to do is just play the scale. The next step is use the notes in your G mixolydian scale and just change the order a little bit so it sounds more like a solo than less of a scale. Again. So you're just going to take those notes and come up with a little idea. Now, the next step is we're going to switch the scale from the G7 to the C7 when we hit the C7 chord. Now, when we hit the C7 chord, we are going to switch to the C mixolydian scale, which is just C to C with a B flat in it. Again, switch up those notes, switch up the order so it doesn't sound so much like a scale. Okay, so now let's put those two together. We're going to play two measures of a G7, so G to G with all naturals, and then two measures of C7, so C to C with the B flat. You can still hear that change. You can hear me changing to the next chord just by the notes that I'm playing. Listen to it one more time. So the way that you change from chord to chord is you just switch the scale that you're playing when you hit the new chord. So you want your scale to line up with the quality of the chord. Now, once you get this concept down where you're making those changes and you're playing the right scale over the right chord, there's a way more melodic way of making that happen. And that is by thinking about the changes between the two chords. So G7 is all natural. C7 just has a B flat. So when you go between the G7 and the C7, you don't necessarily have to think about all of the notes. All you have to do is change that B to a B flat. So what we're doing is we're still playing all the common notes, but we're just changing that B to a B flat. And that will get you the change between the G7 and the C7. Take a listen. You hear that? I'm playing along that line and I don't break up the line. I don't stop. I don't make a big jump anywhere. I just keep playing my line and I change from B naturals to B flats. Take a listen to it one more time. And that's how you improvise between two chords. First, you figure out what the notes in the chord are, and then you can play that as your improv, so chord outline solo. Then you make sure that you know the scale that goes along with the chord that you're playing, and you can play scale outlines, and then you can assimilate the chords. In other words, you can figure out what the common notes are and keep those, and then just switch the sharps, flats, or naturals that you need to change to fit the next chord. So that was a really easy example because the G7 and the C7 only had one different note. So let's do another quick example. This time we're going to do a G7 for two measures and an A7 for two measures. So there's going to be a bigger difference with these two. So with the G7, again, we're all natural. With the A7, we have an F sharp and a C sharp. The G is natural because the 7 is telling you that it's got a flat 7. So we're going to play between A and A with an F sharp and a C sharp. If we play those back to back, G7 up and down, A7 up and down, you'll hear the change. You hear that change? That is what we are looking for when we are playing between two different chords. We want to hear that change in the scale. We want to hear that change in the chord quality. So let's do it with the chords now. So the chord would be G, B, D, F for your G7 and A, C sharp, E, G for your A7. Now let's do a chord outline solo using those two chords. So for G, obviously we're going to use G, B, D, F, and for A, we're going to use A, C sharp, E, and G. You hear that? You can totally hear those chords change because it's just up a major second. Listen to it one more time. Sounds pretty good, right? Now, this time, we are going to play a G mixolydian scale into an A mixolydian scale. So we're going to play G mixolydian, which is all naturals, A mixolydian, which has an F sharp and a C sharp. Take a listen. Do you hear that change? All we are doing is changing the scales so that it fits the chord. And then once you get those scales down, then you're going to think about, okay, my G7 scale is all natural. My A7 scale has an F sharp and a C sharp. So the only two notes that you really need to change are the F sharp and the C sharp when you're playing between those two chords. So G7, all natural, A7, F sharp, C sharp. Take a listen. Sounds pretty good, right? Now, obviously, you also want to switch your important notes. That's what's going to make it sound really good. When you're playing G7, your important notes are going to be your 1, 3, 5, 7, your chord tones, which are G, B, D, and F. And when you're playing A7, your important notes are going to be A, C sharp, E, and G, which are your chord tones in the key of A7. But for those lines to sound really good and really smooth, you want to think about connecting your lines using the key signatures. And that's it. That's how you improvise over two different chords. This works with any chords. If you're playing B minor 7, you just throw in the B minor scale and the B minor chord. If you're playing E major 7, you just throw in the E major chord and the E major scale, and then you figure out the differences between the two. Now, in the beginning, it's definitely a little bit of a challenge to figure out what the different notes are between each chord, but the more you do it, the easier it gets. So the more you practice it, in the beginning, you're going to have to stop and maybe even write it out or figure it out or say it out loud. But as you practice it a lot, it's just going to become a natural part of your playing, and you're going to hear your lines get way smoother. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. If you now understand how to improvise over two different chords, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Leave me some comments if you have some questions or some suggestions for future videos. Thanks a lot.